Okay, I feel it.
Well, hello, everybody. This is Dr. Stacy. You know me by now. And I'm here again for the Mindful World Summit with Jeff Warren. I'm so excited to talk to this man. He's been nicknamed the MacGyver of meditation by his friend Dan Harris, with whom he co-authored Meditation for Fidgety Skeptics, a book about his, I guess it was inspired on the tour that he did, that got in this rock and roll bus with Dan and took meditation to the people and brought it to people who were interested, but also learned from them about some of the challenges in incorporating this in their daily lives. In addition to being a leader and a student of meditation, he's also expanded into bringing this practice to children in new and innovative ways. And so we're here to do a quick but deep dive, I hope, into this practice to learn more and to learn about what you've been learning along the way. Welcome, Jeff, to the summit.
Stacy, thanks for having me.
We're so happy to have you all the way. You're in Costa Rica right now, correct?
I am, and feeling a little guilty about it when I talk to my Canadian friends, but I have a sweet little gig down here where I teach meditation. In exchange, they put me up for some room and board, and it's a nice reset for me.
Oh, amazing. Well, we're happy for you, even if we are a little bit jealous. So I'm curious. I mean, when you go out in this tour bus, which is so rock and roll, I love that. And you meet people wherever they're at, I guess, and maybe some people knew about it, maybe not. What were some of the takeaways from that experience?
Yeah, well, there were many. The intention of the tour was to kind of check in with groups that were already interested in meditation, but were having challenges or finding it helpful, but we're still running into the regular challenges one runs into. So we were talking to military people, to police officers, to caregivers, social workers, to and such a wide variety of different demographics. And that was the most incredible thing for me, was like, wow, the world is changing. All these people are interested in practices and applying them in a very real world, real life kind of way. Yeah. But as the practice teaches you, if you have any experience meditating, as anyone who meditates knows, it sounds great, but then sometimes the actual reality of doing the practice is slightly different. We encounter challenges. So there were some fairly common challenges that would come around again and again and again from people. So the biggest one is probably just like, I don't have time, especially I've been hearing this for years. All my friends are parents and, busy professionals.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really hard one. And that's certainly true of the people we met down there. And there's sort of ways of working with that I could talk about if you wanted to. There were issues around, a lot of people worried that they would somehow lose their edge, that meditation would somehow make them too flabby or easygoing, and they just started to become like a giant doormat, and people would, so there's a response to that. There were people who worried about, what were some of the other ones? People worried about, this was quite common, didn't feel like they were worth it in some way, or felt like, oh, somehow meditation was self-indulgent. Like, oh, there's so many problems in the world. There are so many other people I really need to be helping. I can't take this time for myself, which is just really not understanding the connection between the inner work you do and the outer work we do. Mm-hmm. And so that was very common, especially with caregivers, which is probably not surprising. Like people who spend the most time helping others were often least able to give themselves the practice or space or time. And of course they were getting burned out, because that's what happens if you don't.
Yes.
And then I'll just say one last one was, there were challenges around keeping the habit going, how to do that. And then there were some legitimate challenges too around, some people just worried that, I sit down and meditate, I'm actually don't want to go there because I'm worried that all my tough stuff's going to catch up to me, which can happen. That's a legitimate thing to be aware of, that suddenly it's like we've been avoiding our kind of sadness or our confusion or just general exhaustion by staying busy. And as soon as we sit down, all those things can kind of catch up to us. So I would say those were some of the big worries. And there are ways of, different people work with them in different ways, but there's sort of strategies that you learn as a practitioner and as a teacher around how to work with that. So I could be happy to say a little bit about that, or I can also just say in terms of a big takeaway,
Mhm.
You know, the big takeaway I got was, and I admit that maybe I'm in a bit of a bubble here, but it's hard to not be so demoralized by all the news that you're constantly seeing around environmental challenge and the mental health crisis and so many negative things going on in the world. But this felt like a movement of sanity. You know, it felt like
Mm.
it was a movement of people in all these very different kinds of milieus beginning to take responsibility for themselves in this way. And although mindfulness is one expression of that, it was not, of course, just that. It's people exploring more secular. Mindfulness is quite secular, but other kinds of practices, people
Mm.
exploring other kinds of wellness or yoga perspectives, like, and while that can go into sort of a potentially self-indulgent direction, of course, like anything, you can take it to too much. In general, it felt like a movement of basically people beginning to understand the relationship between, wow, how I am inside and how I'm affecting the world outside, and that the importance of a practice for as
Mhm.
almost part of the social contract, you know. And that's what I
Wow.
took away from that, was like, okay, where's something's interesting happening here. Like this is maybe one of the single biggest good news stories happening in the world right now, and it's kind of happening off the radar. That in all these different ways, people are beginning to get more sane, get more,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad that that was your takeaway. You mentioned the bubble, and when you're in it, you're kind of like, I'm meeting all these people, but is it just because it's me? And then when you try to expand from there, it's just like, oh, no, maybe this is really happening. And I choose to believe it's really happening because of just the experience with the summit and all the people involved and their collective feedback. But, I guess what I'm wondering, I mean, I think all the things that you mentioned in terms of the challenges, I think anyone watching this can relate to. And particularly when we're thinking about parents, this idea of taking the time to do that. And I wonder what your response to anyone out there who is feeling stuck about, like, there's so many other things to do. Like, how can I take this time to do this?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's like I said, it's the number one concern, and I think
Mhm.
that there are a few responses,
Mhm.
a few sort of tips that I've learned, and
Mhm.
I had helped people with, and one of the main ones is kind of working smart. So
Mhm.
meaning that you don't if you're going to make it some big thing that you got to do, oh, I got to fit in this half hour sit somewhere in my schedule, you'll never do it, because maybe
Mhm.
you can, maybe you can, set your intention really strongly and make that happen. But in general, the way habit formation works is it's about working smart. So it's about working with your environment. So what existing obligations do you have in your environment where you, like, for example, you have to wake up in the morning. We all have that. The alarm goes off. You may have like 5 minutes when you arrive at work, when you're sitting in the car, like there's a potential space there, or, you kind of look at your existing routine or structure, the existing, which has already got you in a kind of automatic pattern. And then you try to hack that automaticity by adding in a little secret sneaky practice for 5 minutes here or 5 minutes there, so you make it like brushing your teeth, or you make it like it's just something you do after you put the kids to bed, or before you do this, you kind of try to put it into that structure. So do you see what I mean? It's like
Yeah.
you look at the environmental cues that are already there, that are telling you, oh, time to shift from this thing to this thing, and then you just see if you can make a little bit of space in there to add another action that is the practice. um,
Mhm.
so that's one way of trying to just think about, and knowing that you don't have to do some big giant thing, that a lot of practice is about just reconnecting to just a basic principle of simplicity. Like, for example, like, I mean, there are different practices we can do, but one practice is just recognizing that when we just kind of bring our attention together in a very simple way towards our breath, or to sound, or just to the feeling of sitting here, that's actually quite healthy for the mind. That it's a practice of kind of recollecting the different parts, where you have, like, where ordinarily we're on like 10 different tracks, worried about this and worried about that, and kind of, can you bring all the tracks to bear on just this one thing for a little while? And so it doesn't need to be exotic, it doesn't need to be hard, just that action of doing that simple thing. And I guarantee every one of your listeners already kind of knows this, in the sense that if they
Mhm.
go for a nature walk, or have a bath, or just spend time with their dog, or whatever it is, the more you can kind of converge all your attention on this one thing, the more the mind can start to relax and find this this peaceful quality, and even actually this even deeper. The mind really enjoys one pointedness. So finding some simple thing like that where you can just plug a little bit in here, a little bit in there, and then over time, the idea is that the taste of that starts to be available in more and more situations. So that's another. So that's and then the only thing I would kind of make a little bit clearer about that, if I haven't already, is the most important thing is to come up with your practice. So I would say, like, even if you think for the rest of my life I'm going to be busy, you know, all you have to do, in my view, is in the next couple days, the next 3 days, see if you can, or say the next week, see if you can take maybe 20 minutes to find your practice, to find your home base, like a little simple home base thing that you can kind of do that kind of lets you feel chill wherever you are. And so I would guide that, if I were guiding that in a meditation, I would say, I would guide people to notice, is there some part of their breath that makes them feel kind of relaxed? Some people not so much, other people, yeah, I kind of like this feeling, just the breath. Or is the experience of listening to sounds kind of relaxing for you? Or is the experience of kind of imagining you're breathing up kind of from the earth or something, or feeling your solidness on the cushion or on the chair or whatever it is? Like, I would give people a little mini kind of orientation or exploration, and to find their home base. And then once you know you have the home base, then that's the thing to plug in, the little 5-minute thing, the little here, the little 2-minute thing there. But you now have this sort of idea of a kind of go-to. And many of us have never taken the time to just decide on that. We may know it implicitly that we have a home base, but it's like, no, put a little existential highlighter under what you already know is your home base. And then start practicing it, because a practice is the way to go.
Right. So, you know, and I have to highlight and underscore what you've just suggested, because that's the kind of thing as a psychologist we talk about. Right. So it's just actually, and it's taking away from this idea that has to be this big thing, like 45 minutes, 20 minutes. And I have to think it's almost probably more powerful if it's peppered throughout the day, or just as, than just having this discrete times, very particular place that I do this thing.
Actually, it's so interesting. You nailed it. The research shows that it's much more important to do it more frequently than to do it for a longer time. That it's about, while it's great to have a longer time to do it, the more you can just check in a small way with the direction of where a practice points you, the more, because the nervous system likes that. The nervous system likes regularity. So the more regularly you're tapping into that, the more the nervous system is able to find it in more and more conditions. So I would say it's more important to do 2 10-minute practices a day than to do 1 20-minute, or more important to do 2 20 minutes than 1 40 minutes, or 2 1 minutes than 1 2-minute, you know. There you go.
So much math.
I just blew my mind trying to do that math. Sorry. I may have confused myself there.
Okay. So, and I guess the other misconception, which I think is a big one, or not necessarily a misconception or a potential barrier, of people that are really phobic of going within. Maybe they're going through a hard time and it's just too overwhelming to get quiet. And, you know, are there certain kinds of meditations, like, as I'm listening to you think, as you're describing, find your zone at this time. So maybe it's not so much of within, but focusing on the outside, or is that something, can someone still engage in this practice even if they're going through something really hard and they don't want to face their emotions?
Yes. Thank God you asked this question, and I'm going to answer it. I was thinking from the place we were before, if people don't know how to find the home base, I have a practice on my website that's free. You can just listen to it. It's called Concentration 101. That's kind of about that. And there's another one called Finding the Right Practice that's on there. And those are ones you can do. And similarly, around this question that you just asked, I have a couple practices on my site that are about mindfulness of emotions, RAIN, like using this acronym RAIN. There's one that's shorter, one that's longer. I think they're up there, or they're maybe on my SoundCloud. Like, I'm just trying to get more organized. So those are ones that you can do to in a sense, as a response to what you're asking.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll try to elaborate a little bit from your question, because
Mm-hmm.
it's super, super important. And it's actually a very, the thinking on this is changing a little bit. In the early days of like, oh, wow, meditation is amazing, it must be the solution for everything that our culture went through, you know, in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and we're even seeing it now, the mindfulness craze, like, oh gosh, like cure all. It's not, you know, mindfulness is a wonderful tool, but people are beginning to realize that in certain contexts, it actually may not be that helpful. And the primary context when that's true is the context you just described, where you're really dealing with a ton of stuff and there's a lot coming up. And if by sitting and opening to it, which is the normal instruction, mindfulness instruction, you can actually dysregulate yourself a little bit. You can, because what happens is it comes up in an intensity, and you can end up feeling like, oh gosh, this is really kind of taking me out of myself. This isn't that great. So, and this is where a kind of more complicated response is needed, because in the traditional mindfulness way, that can happen, and we may still be able to stay with that in this very open way. And in the staying with it, we can notice that it kind of comes up as a surge and then it kind of comes down again. And actually, by staying open, we begin to discharge some of those energies. So it can really help. Other times, that is going to be too dysregulating. So you need to pace yourself. So if you're going to use that technique, it means you stay with the experience. As it starts to get intense, you open a little bit, and then you say, you know what, this is good for me. And then you back up and you send your attention to this home base sensation, that somewhere that feels comforting or feels regulating in your experience. And then you can kind of do this titration thing where you go in a little bit and then pull back. And then when you feel resourced and like you're steady, you can go in a little bit more and then pull back. So that's a strategy that's legit. But there's more. Another strategy is to not go there at all. If you're going to be doing a practice, you either do a practice that's about focusing somewhere else. So focusing on from the beginning on your home base, or on sounds, or something that's more neutral in your experience. And that can be, you just do that, this kind of focus away strategy. And as you get more and more concentrated on that other thing, often the nervous system will start to cool out, so that other activation can start to chill. But then the most important thing to say is sometimes it's not meditation at all. You need to do a movement thing, or you need to just talk to someone, or you need to go for a walk in nature, that those strategies are more valuable. And definitely if you've got a lot of trauma in your system, then, I mean, in my mind, without question, you should be, the most important intervention is a kind of somatic, trauma-based therapeutic intervention, where you're talking to a person who can be that safe place for you, and they're giving you strategies of how to work with it in the body. So, I mean, a meditation practice can really take care of that, but we just don't know. And so it's better if you really have a lot of that trauma to work with someone who can work with you a little bit one-on-one, and then they can actually do some practices with you, like a mindfulness practice, and see how you're working with it and give you the proper responses. So, so that's, you know, I'm trying to be general, to give you a kind of generic responses of different strategies, but it so much depends on the individual. And if I were working with them, I'd be kind of feeling that out and looking and seeing where, how they respond to that. And if there's someone that had a lot of trauma, you know, I had myself a lot of trauma, like both shock traumas from a lot of physical injury and some developmental stuff. I had to get help. The meditation practice wasn't enough. I had to find a kind of trauma-based intervention to help discharge some of that stuff.
So it's not just one thing, but with the right kind of support, depending where you're at, if you start and it's just too much, maybe that's a sign of like, okay, I need some more support. And I can start somewhere, and wherever that is comfortable for me is okay.
Absolutely. And the principle here is like, you're your own teacher. You know your nervous system better than anybody. And so you can try, these techniques are like these, you think of them as these ideals. There's a general instruction and there's a kind of idea or an intention behind around the instruction, around what it may do or what it may help us with. But we always have to compare the ideal to our lived experience and a teacher is not as intimate with your nervous system as you are. So you have to go, okay, does this feel like it's the right thing for me? actually it does. When I do this, I feel enormous healing. I feel this great sense of a weight lifting off my shoulders. I can feel that it's really helping. Or
Mhm.
does it feel like, you know what, it's too much right now?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, and so the other thing that I hear quite a bit, and I'm sure you do too, and people will just say, I can't meditate. My head's all over the place and it's not relaxing. And like, I don't know what the secret sauce is, but I can't do this. Like some
Yeah,
version of that.
yeah.
I mean, what's your response to people who say like, I've tried this thing and
Mhm.
I don't know. I can't get with it.
Yeah, oh yeah, I meant to say that was probably the second most common one after Don't Have
Okay.
Time. I can't do it. So part of it is like understanding, um, a lot of that comes from people thinking, I can't turn off my thoughts. It's really like, my
Mhm.
thoughts are basically like a freaking Tasmanian devil ripping a hole through the inside of my head, and I'm trying to sit, and it's the least relaxing thing of my life. So a lot of it is if you can help give people the right framework for thinking about it. And the right framework is you're not trying to stop your thoughts. You're just trying to change your relationship to your thoughts. So it's about unproblematizing the fact that thinking is still happening. And so there's a kind of move there around equanimity where you just notice that thinking is happening and you just kind of let it play out. And then you do your best you can to pay attention to your home base. And if you just have this stance of starting from there in the first place, that can often take care of a lot of the challenges. And it's just knowing that that's just a kind of thing that you work towards, that you have to be patient, that at first it can be challenging, but the more you come back, the more you get in the habit of just letting the thoughts be there without worrying about it so much, the more that it gets more and more easier and easier to do. So that's
Mhm.
one response. Another one is about kind of finding the right technique for you, like exploring a few different things, because not all meditations are the same. You know, you might
Mhm.
work with the breath and find it just makes you very triggered and, oh gosh, it makes you anxious, but then you find that if you just, because you never thought about it, someone finally says, well, why don't you just pay attention to this thing over here, the feeling of the warmth in your hands or the sounds in the distance, and they find
Mhm.
that that actually takes care of things.
Right.
So there's that too.
Mhm.
But my most meta answer of all is you don't need a meditation. What you need is a practice. And practice can be something you take on the road. It doesn't have to look like sitting still. It can be,
Mhm.
you can integrate the skills of practice into running,
Yeah.
into drawing, into creative writing, into talking to a person with earphones on through Skype. And that's, once you kind of know how that works, then you're like, you can find the practice that works for you.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I love that. Thank you, because we have to get away from the rigid idea, right? And this kind of perfectionist idea of like if we're not doing it right. And what strikes me, what I love about this practice is the practice of the attitude,
Big time.
right? And that is what's kind of infectious.
Hmm. Well, it's interesting you're saying that. There are some teachers who would say that and I agree, that the absolute foundation of every practice is the attitude. It's the attitude of the mind. And the proper attitude of the mind is, can I just, what's preventing me from just accepting my own experience right now? I'm accepting from just beginning from the place that this is where I am, and I can accept that this is what's happening in my experience. And then your experience may be challenging, it may be easy, it could be all these other things, but you begin from the place of mature acceptance. And that is where, in a way, every practice begins from. It's the main thing we're trying to train. The main thing
Mm-hmm.
we're trying to train is just the capacity to be, just appreciative and present in our own experience. It's that simple. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's
And
simple.
that makes it that hard.
It's
Yeah,
simple and hard. As for humans, it's hard, but it's amazing how much growth and connection and all good, so many good things come out of that.
big time.
But we have to practice it because our world doesn't necessarily support it.
Well, it's all about the practice. I
Yeah.
sometimes think of it as like, we are what we repeatedly do.
Hmm.
That just by living, we're actually in a habit. We're practicing being in a particular way, and most of us just don't know that's happening. So we're practicing being a little bit more annoyed or a little bit more freaked out about our situation, and we're deepening that habit. So if you start at
Hmm.
some point, the practice begins when you kind of wake up from that. And so actually, I think I'm going to start to practice a different habit. I'm going to practice being deliberately a little bit more appreciative, or deliberately a little bit more peaceful, or a little bit more appreciative of moments of simplicity in my life. And it begins with that decision. And then, like any habit, we just slowly build it up, and we have to be kind of patient with it as it gets more entrenched.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of building habits, you've started to expand into working with children, and bringing meditation to them where they're at. And I'm curious to hear a little bit about that piece of work for you and what you're learning in the process of doing that.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm still early in my learning curve. So the first thing to say is that I feel like a bit of a fraud here, because I think probably every single one of your listeners has more experience with kids in some ways, because I'm not a parent and I'm not an educator or teacher. I mean, I do have my brother has, 3 kids, and I have lots of friends with kids. So I do spend time with kids, but I'm still kind of learning myself. But, and most of what I've learned comes from what I've learned from adults, in the sense that, like, realizing the importance of sort of 2 things. First of all, we all need practices. And in a way, kids are no exception. Like and kids are enormously capable, and because of their imaginations and their openness and their capacity to adopt practices and very quickly get it. I mean, they're way better students in some ways than parents, like way better.
Yes.
So it's the understanding the importance of a practice, and then the importance of actually meeting people exactly where they are. Like, instead of saying, oh, here's this ideal, why aren't you there? Why aren't you this like perfect, shiny, happy Buddha? It's like, no. That's just gonna make people go,
Whatever.
We're not even start. It's saying, okay, we're starting over here, like where I am, neurotic and freaked out and anxious. And how do we kind of like begin with the real recognitions of our challenges, and then build a practice that meets there and builds out. Mm-hmm. So in the case of little kids, it's like, I would just think, okay, when I started to create these little guided practices that are on this KidEvolve website, and they're free. Okay. So if people want to, they can listen to them. Mm-hmm. And I started thinking, okay, well, when I was a kid, what did I have challenges with? And I would remember, oh man, I had so many. I had a lot of challenges with dysregulation. I'd get really hyperactive, and I couldn't control my bounciness, or I would I couldn't control my impulse control. I still have that problem as an adult. But I remember also being at school and seeing people getting bullied and feeling really like I didn't know what to do in those situations. Mm-hmm. Like I felt, and feeling frozen, or feeling anxious about, I knew I had to do something in school the next day, and I was going to have to go up in front of everyone, and being really anxious. And like, so it's like, it begins with really taking seriously, like, what are kids dealing with? Like, your kids, where are they at? What is a real thing going on in their life that is like, for us, it might seem, oh, this is not a big deal, but for them, it's the whole world. So I would start with a scenario, and then I would try to think of, well, what is a practice that I could give this little kid, or kids like this, that could help them reorient in the moment. And so it's all about like, so these things we did they're like these little guided practices, but they're much more like stories. And they have sound effects and visualizations, and they really draw on the imagination. And it's to get the kid to stop and use their imagination to think about a scenario. And then there's a little intervention of some kind. Like, now notice you can find the calming part of the breath, and imagine that's kind of going right through you, for example, something like that. Or imagine that you're in a giant spacesuit. So the situation is kind of challenging. Can you let the situation be there? But every time you breathe in, your spacesuit gets a little wider, and it feels like a little more bearable how to work with this thing here. Or it's a thing of like, okay, imagine that you're a robot, and that, you look inside, and there's just like nothing in there, but you've got a heart in there. And every time you breathe, you start to feel a little bit more of your heart, and a little bit more of your heart. And then you kind of turn that into a compassion practice or something. And
wow.
I mean, and kids, it's crazy. A kid, they are so powerful. They go right there.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. Oh my gosh. I'm just Sorry, I lost my presence for a minute there. I was thinking about lying on the floor and listening to these with my two kids. But it's true. Like the kids are so much better at this. And is
So
it,
much better.
yeah. And you mentioned before, because the kids are different in their temperament. And, if there's sometimes meditations that are more moving, like physically you're getting up a little bit more, or.
Yeah, definitely. So that's
Okay.
another thing. Like, I don't try to, I don't actually think, so you have to come at this with the recognition that kids aren't the same as adults. So even though you begin from certain principles that we're all human, the kid's nervous system is different. And a kid, for the most part, I don't think it's good for any kid to sit still for too long. So you don't want to turn these kids into like your weird idea of what stillness or peace is supposed to look like in an adult.
Right.
So I do these ninja practices with kids where it's like, yeah, it's first about noticing that there is a tendency to want to be super excitable, and can you come to center and kind of relax that a little bit? But also then can you re-energize? So you're not trying to teach them to be flatlined, or you're trying to teach them to have flexibility between being buoyant and then also being able to kind of be still for a moment and then be more buoyant. So to do that, I often lead practices where they're standing, or I'll get them to actually jump around in the practice, whether they're listening to a guided meditation, or to move their arms and float around like they're an octopus or whatever it is. Like, so and the more you can engage the whole body, the more you embody the practice, the more the practice lands. And so you're giving them this adventure, and then you're saying, now remember, next time you're in that situation, remember how it felt in your body to do this, and connect what you're feeling in the body with your imagination. So then in that moment, they have this little intervention they can draw on. And that's what my friends or parents have said has happened with those things, that they say their kids use these all the time. Like, they don't have to go listen to it now. They just remember, oh, in this moment, I can do this little thing where I can breathe and feel a little bit like I'm in my space, a little bit more space around me, or feel a little bit more friendly in a situation where normally I'd be like, or whatever it is.
What's so brilliant about that? Because what I hear is like, oh, you know about that neuroplasticity thing. You know about how we need to like actually pay attention, have it be like a full body experience as opposed to just something up here.
Exactly. Well, I mean, all the really cutting edge research in mindfulness now is saying that mindfulness is basically, it's integrating what we know with what we feel, or like integrating our kind of cognition with our affect. That in some way, it's like it's almost like these two things don't talk to each other in some way. That's what happens in trauma, is you have this emotional response that keeps spinning around and around and around and around, and it hasn't been kind of integrated with the understanding that we're safe in this moment. And so you have to connect the capacity to understand and to know with what the body is feeling, and to integrate it into a single gestalt. And that's what healing is. That's what integration is.
Right. So we're giving more power to that positive, grounded, centered feeling by making it like really tuning into the body. And I love the whole movement thing that you add to that. That's brilliant. Wow.
Well, it also can be fun for parents to do with their kids. So
sure.
Because the other big, and then this is the other big takeaway in this, is that these things can be really helpful for kids, to certainly having a little practices, little interventions. But we all know that the most important thing for a kid is, it's the role model. It's the role model also practicing being centered, practicing being compassionate, because whether you know it or not, your kid's nervous system is learning from you. Your kid's nervous system is like basically internalizing your responses to the world, because that's how it works. So that's like obviously the most sobering piece of advice, that kind of like, oh shit. But on the other hand, it's also the really positive advice. It's just there's just no getting around it. It's the reality of how nervous systems and the world is. So with that knowledge, that's why it's so valuable for a parent to find those 5 minutes to have a practice, but also keeping in mind the good enough parenting caveats that like, no one's going to be perfect. God knows,
Sure.
It's like your kids also learn from your challenges, and they learn a lot from the way you are, how honest you're able to be about your challenges. Like, that's a huge gift to give a kid, to not hold yourself to some standard. And so
it's that acceptance thing all over again. right?
Yeah,
Acceptance and
totally.
compassion, and it's all wrapped up in that. That's why it's so powerful. Thank you for that. I know that we'll mention the website again near the end, but I'm wondering if I can diverge a little bit, and just because you are such a student of this, a teacher of this, and you consume, build communities all around this, and I'm just curious about your bird's eye view on some things. Could I just ask you some questions that are just out of the blue kind of thing that's a bit divergent from what we were talking about, but is
Sure.
related? I'm curious about your answer. So what is an emerging problem that no one is talking about that you feel we really need to address?
Um, uh, well, I would say the biggest problem, the biggest white elephant in the room, the biggest elephant in the room for me is this somehow people not understanding that there's a direct correlation between the outside and the inside. And that when we look around at a sick world where the environment is sick, and people are, and mental health, it's not a coincidence that mental health, challenges are skyrocketing.
Mm-hmm.
The people are sick because the environment is sick. It's like you can't separate those two. So you can't hide away from the world's problems over here and expect to be able to create a perfect circle of health for yourself. That, like, to me, it's like the world is showing us that we can't hide, like, that our need to change the world is directly related to our own inner practices, and that we have to simultaneously have an interest in external activism and an interest in internal work. And that if we don't make the connection between those two things, then we're in a real problem. Either we're too identified in our activism and we don't give ourselves the inner self-care work, and then we get burned out and we actually make things worse.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of activists, I think, are actually making some of these things worse by their fixatedness and their anger and their drivenness. But similarly, in our inner practices, if we are fooling ourselves if we think we can come to a place of perfect peace with the world being what it is, that we have to be and by ignoring the world, I should say, that we have to be engaged in some meaningful way with that change. And even if it means the changes in our small circle of how we conduct how we are with our family or whatever, like, and so I guess that would be it's like really drawing the link between the inside and out. Sometimes I think that it's like people think it's a coincidence that mental health things are skyrocketing and then there's an environmental crisis. It's like the two are part of a single process.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, because I think that like one of my beefs is that sign, like, good vibes only. Like it's almost taking this idea of mindfulness or Zen, that the world could be exploding around you, and it's like, don't bother me out of my little bubble of Zen. And we have to kind of, and the other side too, that if we're not embodying empathy and compassion as we go about trying to make a change, then it creates more problems, just as you said. So thank you for that. It's really, really wise. What do you think is a major issue that if we solve will make the biggest difference in the world? You've kind of alluded to it in your last answer. I don't know if there's anything else that comes to mind.
Yeah, well, what comes to mind is it's around the democratization of mental health. So it's around recognizing and honoring the need for specialists, that there are more need for specialists than ever, but that not giving away our power and saying, oh, I can't begin to address those things until I speak to one of those perfect teachers or perfect specialists. That we need to start actually kind of being our own teachers and sharing practices, even if, so it's, in my view, it's much better to be an amateur share of practice than to not share a practice at all. And that's a little different than what some other people might think, who might say, oh, we don't want to do it wrong and all those things. And those are legitimate concerns around trying to share practices safely. But I think we don't have time to all become perfect paragons of mental health. I mean, that's one thing I learned from this book, is like, I am far from paragon of mental health. I've got ADD. I've got major mood dysregulation issues that I struggle with. Like, I've had a lot of these mental health challenges, and yet I found myself in a position where I was sharing practices, and I had to get really real about where I was and still do it, despite the fact that I'm just a train wreck in some ways. So I think, yeah.
No, I really appreciate that. And that's really helpful for people to hear, that the teachers, all of us have our stuff and we all work through it. But we all have a responsibility, and there's so much you can learn.
Mhm.
And part of what, when you have the honor of meeting with people in the process of change, there's so much wisdom that comes from people in that position, right? And so one of
Yes.
the cool things is things like this, where we get to learn from
Yeah.
each other and share that knowledge in a big way.
Yeah. And just to add to that just for a second, like there's such a beautiful side to this. And the beautiful side is, in a way, the most creative thing you can do in your life, the most creative medium in your life is your practice. It's not the work of art that you create on a canvas. It's not the song that you make. It's the way, the creative form that you decide to meet the world in. The way in which you decide to begin to how you choose to practice compassion, how you choose to practice steadiness, to get grounded. You develop a practice that is like your most creative thing, and you begin to learn to see how this works for you, and then you can pass that on. You can show your kid, you can show your friend, this is what I do. And it's
Mm.
like your greatest creative work becomes your greatest gift, and you
Mm.
pay it forward. And you don't pay it forward saying do exactly this. You say, here's what I did, now find one for you to do. This is what I've learned that seems to work for me. And someone says, oh, thanks. And then they do that, and then they pay it forward. And it's like,
Mhm.
that's a world I want to live in, a world where basically the sharing and the creativity and the compassion starts to go viral, where we all know we're here to find our practice and share it, and then help empower someone else to do the same. And it's just
Mhm.
like, that is, to me, if there's ever going to be something, if the world is going to get to a better place, it's going to come somehow through that dynamic, is going to be part of it, you know?
Mhm.
Um, and, and the one other wonderful thing about that is, insofar as you can just be real and honest with yourself, where you are, and you're just totally honest, this is who I am, this is where I am, this is what I'm struggling with, that is embodying a teacher. That's embodying the very thing that you need to be embodying to pay it forward. And all of us can do that at any time. You don't need to get to some special high level place. Every human can be honest about where they are in the moment. In that moment, you're actually acting from a place of being a teacher. You know, I would say
Mhm.
you're acting from a place of being a human.
I love that. I love that. That we're all teachers here, but we just need to get in touch with the truth that we can offer. Right?
Totally.
Amazing.
Totally. Yeah.
Amazing. Um, Jeff, you mentioned your resources a few times. Could you just one more time just mention those places people can go to connect with your writings, your teachings, the meditations that you give away?
Sure. So I have a website, jeffwarren.org,
Mhm.
and there's a whole ton of free meditations on there. There, I also have a whole bunch I put on SoundCloud. If you just Google
Okay.
my name, and then also the nonprofit that I started, called the Consciousness Explorers Club. That website is cecmeditate.com, and there's a ton of free meditations up there and resources, including a free community activation guide. So if it's a kind of resource to help people start up their own local community practice group. And it talks about how to guide a practice safely, and talks about trauma sensitive mindfulness and the joy of starting a local practice group. And it's totally free because the CEC is a nonprofit. And then the last thing I would say is for the kids, my friend Kirsten Chase has a really cool website. It's called KidEvolve. I think it's
Mm.
www.kidevolve.com. If you Google KidEvolve, and they're called Creative Mind Journeys. So they're all there, and they're all free. And there's a lot from me, but also from other contributors. And you can just listen to them with your kids and see what works, see what the issues are that we kind of describe, and see if any of those kind of fit with your kid, and play around, and maybe it'll work and maybe it won't, but it can't hurt. So
Right.
yeah,
Thank you so much for that. And Jeff, this has been so great. I want to live in that world, and hopefully we're co-creating that world together. Before we go, could you tell us, give us please your most profound statement?
being human takes practice.
Yes, I love that. Awesome. That's a t-shirt.
It's actually the slogan of the CC.
Okay.
I was like,
Awesome.
but it's true. I
Yeah.
wish someone had told me that when I was a kid, because I didn't know. I just
Yeah.
was like, when I was an agonized adult, just so mad about so much stuff. I didn't realize that I was just deepening that habit of being mad. I didn't know that, it's very sobering, that understanding, but it's also ultimately what becomes very liberating. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Jeff Warren, thank you so much for contributing here to this summit and for everything that you're doing. I can't wait to meet up with you in Toronto and we can talk some more about all the ways we can change the world together. Okay.
I look forward to that. That'd be great. Really
All
great
right,
to meet
Jeff.
you, Stacy. Thanks for
Okay.
all the stuff you're doing. It's awesome.
Thank you so much. You take care and enjoy the sun.
Okay. Bye.
Okay, bye.